Good afternoon, everyone.
Good
This
afternoon.
week, as we celebrate Women's History Month, I get to do something that feels both like homecoming and a holy moment. Because today I am joined by two women whose brilliance, courage, and integrity have shaped the very landscape of fair housing in this country and who have shaped me. Sarah Pratt, my queen, my mentor, my teacher, the woman who trained me and believed in my voice long before I fully understood the weight of this work. Her fingerprints are on the policies, the cases, the protections, and the people who now carry this movement forward. Alongside her is the incomparable Carol Brown, scholar, lawyer, truth teller, and was one of the most formidable Black women in the legal academy. Her scholarship forces this nation to reckon with race, land, power, and the law with both rigor and moral urgency. So, yes, I'm absolutely fangirling today because these are not just experts. These are women who have built pathways where none existed, who have mentored generations, who have insisted that equity is not an option, and who have done it all with brilliance, courage, and grace. And so, welcome, welcome.
Great to be here. What an introduction.
What an
Wow.
Y'all deserve it. You deserve it. So I'm just so excited. You can tell I'm really, really excited to have you all here today. When you all are looking at this, I just tell first. I know I introduced you, but I really didn't. So, Carol, if you could tell the audience a little bit about um, your work and then and how we got to this book, and then I'll ask Sarah to chime in as well.
Yes, well, thank you so much, Stella, for having Sarah and me on your podcast. This is a real joy. So, my story is a pretty straightforward one. I'm from Greensboro, North Carolina, grew up in North Carolina
Hey,
all of
hey.
my life, exactly. I've practiced law in Virginia and in Alabama. I teach in the areas of housing law, land use planning, real estate transfers, and then a basic property law course. And I came to this project. Really, this project started. I was looking in my notes, preparing for our time together back in November of 2021.
Wow.
And yeah, exactly. Wow. And the goal was to create a contemporary guide to fair housing law that detailed properly the intricacies, the nuances of fair housing law, but that also situated fair housing law within contemporary American society. And putting fair housing law within that context was really important, I think, for this book because fair housing law and fair housing dilemmas and challenges are really dynamic. We're in a very different fair housing landscape today than in 1968 when the Fair Housing Act was passed. So issues like algorithmic bias and the impact of AI on access to housing are things that no one imagined in 1968. And so that's really what motivated me to want to create this treatise. And I first met Sarah back in 2018. I teach at the University of Alabama, excuse me, at the University of Richmond School of Law. I started at the University of Alabama, then went to the University of North Carolina. I'm now at the University of Richmond. But in 2018, I was at Richmond sponsoring a symposium commemorating the 50th anniversary of the Federal Fair Housing Act. And I invited Sarah to serve as a panelist, and she thankfully agreed. She was brilliant. And I remember when I first met her, she said, I I I don't need a heavy touch. In other words, she was saying, look, I know, give me my marching orders. I know how to do it. I don't need to be managed. And that was so much the case. And so when I first started this project, Sarah was still working. She had not retired. And so it didn't feel like the right time to ask her to join. But when I learned from a mutual friend that she had retired, because we wanted this project to have context setting, I thought it was really important to have someone with expertise as a litigator, as a practitioner. So I asked Sarah, fingers crossed, hoping that as she transitioned out of practice, that she might be willing to take this project on. And literally, I held my breath. She said yes, and she was ending her practice and taking this project on. She didn't even take a week off, I don't think.
Oh no,
so
she didn't do that.
Right. And so here we are. And for me, it's been a great partnership. I've learned an incredible amount. Sarah's practitioner tips, which are embedded deeply in the treatise, are a real gift for anyone thinking about litigating in this area or experiencing fair housing dilemmas. It's a real, it makes all the difference in the treatise. And so that's really kind of a long but short story about how the treatise came about how I got involved with it.
So Sarah, tell me what inspired you to work with Carol on this project, and how you see it, as a good opportunity for both you to share your expertise, but for us as practitioners out here in the world.
Yeah. Well, I'm also really excited to be here today, and this podcast is actually part of the reason why I got involved in the book in the first place. I've had a 50-year career in fair housing, one way or the other, and I mean, I got something from the Kentucky Bar Association calling me a senior counselor, and it's either because I turned 75 or because I've been paying dues to them for 50 years. They anointed me a senior counselor. That's a burden. But there's also kind of the joy that I always get in talking to people about cases and sharing the knowledge that I've acquired, often with a few hard knocks associated with it, to other people. And I wanted to be able to continue downloading the things that were in my head and from my experience in this arena, at a state agency, at HUD, as a practitioner, as a consultant, all of those kinds of issues, and put them all in one place so people could have access. And Carol's offering me the opportunity to participate was really fortuitous. I was in the process of retiring. I did not take a break between retiring and working on the book, and I gave up my first summer on the beach to work on this book. And it's a challenge because the landscape of fair housing is in such horrible flux. It is so devastating what we're seeing to the movement and to the enforcers of fair housing across the country in multiple ways. We had to do a huge update in November of last year to catch up with all the bad things that had happened since we finished the first round of writing a few months earlier. And blessed be University of Richmond and the law students who worked on this, because we've created permalinks for a lot of the material that HUD has taken down from the website so practitioners can still access it. It's still relevant guidance. The book itself is still relevant guidance for how we move forward today in fair housing for enforcement. But it also, as Carol points out, is contextual. It's contextual for thinking about your community today and what tools you've got to try to bring your community or your location back up into fair housing world, into a place where it is operating in a way that's consistent with fair housing principles. And so I think the book does both of those things. It's a practitioner's guide, and it's also a context for taking action. It's a practitioner's guide for lawyers and investigators and those folks, written in plain language, pretty much, with some citations at the bottom. But also, it's a guide to communities who are thinking about change, still proceeding with changes in their community, with or without the federal fair housing enforcement system.
So, both of you have brought up points that have been weighing in on my mind as well. Um, and Sarah, you know, I always try to stay at the point of the spear in the fresh snow of what's going on.
Yeah.
But again, things have moved at such a rapid pace that I know I, for one, am looking forward to getting a copy of this book. Algorithmic bias, AI, um, the ability of just the commonly available AI to integrate into your life, right? Me and my chat, you know, my co-pilot, I call a CP, and we're on first name basis, and we're chit chatting all the time, and that's kind of scary. Um, and yet the machine learning is learning at such a pace that it's hard to keep up with it, and we still don't have. And I've always been of the assumption, Carol, that garbage in, garbage out, and the biases that are baked into our society are baked into these algorithms. And I'm curious about how you and Sarah see the tools. Do we still have the tools available to be able to peel back these onions? You know, what's the approach to, if we have to if we have to look at this from a disparate impact perspective without the administrative guidance? Are we all on our own? I mean, is this? I know everything happened at such a pace. Um, were you all able to address that, or give us some guidance in that in the book?
Well, yes, thanks to, again, thanks in large part to Sarah and her body of work litigating in this area. I think it's true that the digital age disparities are just the possibilities for algorithmic amplification of bias is really undeniable. I don't think that we should panic. I do think that as we embrace AI more, there are scholars who are researching how you set up guardrails to try to avoid or to discern perhaps unintended biases that are embedding themselves, and then to manage those. But AI is still very new ground for all of us. And so just like other areas of life and law are vulnerable to our increasing use of AI, so is fair housing work, and so is housing discrimination work. I do think that there's scholars thinking about it. I think that there are folks in the technical area with technical AI expertise who are looking into how we manage AI bias in general. But I don't think we should be discouraged. And I think that, as Sarah said, a lot of the federal law is in flux, but we still have our state judicial and administrative systems and protections that that are available for us. And as we know, some states have more robust protections than others. And so I think what we have to do is embrace AI, figure out how to set up these appropriate guardrails, um, remember the federal guidance that's there and that Sarah mentioned we have captured. Look at your state administrative and judicial options, and stay connected with other individuals who are at the top of the game with regard to fair housing work. And just stay connected to that community and just try to stay on top of this very rapidly evolving landscape.
Sarah, I want to ask you, I know the MLS system is kind of all over the map now, and it's incorporating when NAR was busted up, or we're starting to see a whole lot of listings that are private, that are only being shown, that the listing is private, the sale is private, and or you have to, and that is a way of locking out enough, buyers of color. I mean, that's what happened in the past, and now using technology to get around fair housing laws and to make sure that all qualified buyers have an opportunity to know about a listing. And how do we attack? How do we attack that? Will we be using just the regular 804, or will we be looking at the MLS piece of the law? How are we going to address those kinds of things going forward?
Well, I think 804A, the otherwise deny or withhold property, is the magic language that courts have used since the act was first passed in 1968 to cover a multitude of sins in fair housing world. And so that's where I would start, although there is a specific provision about multiple listings in the act itself. I don't, so the whole thing about some of these practices, it's going back to the past in multiple ways. And it's hard to prove that they're doing that intentionally, but how they select the houses that are where the listing is to be private, and you look for unequal treatment in the experiences of home buyers who are trying to identify a house that's in that price range and in that neighborhood, and how they're treated and whether they're told about it. And so as someone who's participated in large projects testing for discrimination in the real estate sales industry, I can pretty well imagine that not everyone is following the civil rights or the fair housing rules when they're doing this process. And it'll be up to us at the local level to do the investigations that will be necessary. I do want to echo a little bit what you're asking about and what Carol talked about more broadly, and that is that there are many policies and processes out there that have been challenged over the years on the basis that they disproportionately disqualified people of color or women or families with children, the so-called disparate impact analysis. And the thing about the disparate impact analysis, I have seen over and over again, very politically hot. And yet, when you really get down to it, a lot of times it's still about unequal treatment, the old stuff, the old kind of discrimination. And so I remember years ago investigating cases against State Farm and Allstate in the 90s, y'all. And there was this whole thing about they had this policy that they would not insure houses built before 1950. That was one of them. And another one was they wouldn't insure houses valued at under $50,000. Remember, these were the 50s. I mean, this was the 90s. So we hardly have any houses under $50,000 anymore. But without regard to the condition the houses were in, whether they'd been rewired and all of that stuff. So they were not really challenging the policies were not really supported by facts that showed risk to the insurance companies. And yet, when we heard about these policies and we looked at what the investigation showed, you know what we found? More often than not, the policies were only told about to Black people and not to white people.
Right.
For the white folks, they figured out a way to get them the insurance. For Black folks, not so much. And so, although disparate impact cases can still be brought, even in federal court, depending on where your case arises, some courts are not welcoming disparate impact analysis these days, and some are making it harder than it used to be to prove these cases. But I always say start with unequal treatment, because underneath it all, it's quite likely that there is some intentional discrimination going on. And even when it's not intentional, like I want to exclude Black people or something, it is a built-in, that inherent bias that thinks about how white people do things and where they live and how they behave, as opposed to how people of color live and behave and look for products.
Yeah, it's been my experience that if there's a disparate impact, you don't even have to go 3 feet deep. You will find the intent to discriminate. It may not have been the perpetrators of the current crime,
Yeah,
but it was certainly the foundation that was laid.
that's right. It has its origins in bias.
Mhm.
You know, that came really true to me in a case which we talk about in the book a little bit, and which I worked on, was the homeowners association in Texas that had lots and lots of single family units, and a good number of them were rented to people with vouchers who were also people of color. 93% of the voucher holders at Providence Village, which is the property, the community involved, were Black. So when the HOA decided that they were going to stop renting to people with vouchers, the impact was felt on people of color, on Black people in that property. And HUD did a good investigation in that case. It has filed with HUD. HUD did a good investigation. And you know what they found? Even though this looked like a disparate impact case, it turns out it was completely intentional, and there was huge evidence of bias among residents and decision makers of really nasty racist behavior, which HUD capsulized in its determination that there was a discrimination under the Fair Housing Act based on race and color at that property. So many cases have a disparate impact component, but they also have an intent component. And for those of us working in enforcement, the book tells you this as a practitioner's tip: always look for unequal treatment and for underlying intent before you move to disparate impact, because often you can win your case on that. And if you can't, there are cases in which disparate impact or inferred intent are being successful in many, many courts still today.
Mm-hmm. When you all were working on this book, when you compare earlier moments in fair housing history with what's going on today, what feels familiar and what feels fundamentally different from how housing discrimination was addressed in the past?
Well, just so for me, what I find intriguing is the way in which housing discrimination has, I'll say, morphed. In 1968, coming out of the Kerner Commission report and race riots in 68, we were thinking mostly about, I think, this Black-white divide. And now I think that is still there, and oftentimes the discrimination complaints that bring in the other protected classes will also have a racial component. But I find some of the really interesting new landscapes to be in the area of disability or handicap, which of course was not a protected class in the 1968 Act. And I find it really interesting to think about architectural discrimination and how we are excluding people based on their economic status, which has a disparate impact on minorities, on single mothers that have minor children, just the ways in which we are zoning our public spaces to manage and keep out populations based on wealth or lack of wealth, and then how that reverberates across family status, race, and gender. And so for me, that is one of these kind of part of the dynamism of how fair housing dilemmas have evolved since the Fair Housing Act was initially passed in 1968 and the subsequent amendments. And I just find it extremely interesting. And I think it presents additional challenges, but also maybe additional opportunities to really try to dig in and look at our zoning practices to see where we might have subtle exclusionary moves going on, not just zoning out public housing or zoning out multifamily housing, but other types of zoning decisions we make with regard to transportation and bridges and other kinds of public spaces that disparately impact individuals.
Yeah, that reminds me of something that's going on here in Durham that has me really frustrated. We have 6 parks that are contaminated by all kinds of waste, radioactive waste, all kinds of hazardous chemicals. And all 6 of these, well, 5 of the 6 are in historically redlined Black parks that served Black folks. The one white park had uneven land, so they took soil from a nearby Black park and filled it in, and that's how that one ended up being contaminated. And it's absolutely attributable to zoning decisions that were made in the past, but the discrimination is still occurring. The funding to remediate the parks, communities were promised funding. They just recently passed a bond to a Parks and Rec bond, but did not include the remediation in the Parks and Rec bond. So all the new white parks are going to be upgraded and updated while children living in these historic Black neighborhoods are still being contaminated. And so when you can't, one of the chapters in your book is about how do we strengthen inclusive communities, and how do we and I was so using the affirmatively furthering pieces of the law to kind of address, no, you've got to fix those parks, and now how do we, the law is still there. So how do we, as advocates in neighborhoods, use, what are the approaches that you're talking about in that strengthening inclusive communities chapter of your book?
I'll talk about a couple of points, and then Carol should chip in on this. I think, with the Fair Housing Act, you have a statute of limitations issue. What's the last act of discrimination? And in the circumstances you're describing, the failure to remediate is potentially an act of discrimination. So has that come within the timeframes? But one of the advantages to an affirmatively furthering fair housing process, which the current administration has unfortunately decimated the oversight of that and the development of that, but the obligation to affirmatively further fair housing is broader than the statute of limitations issues. And it says when it's confronted with these issues, these kinds of issues, it has an affirmative responsibility to identify them and take action. they're harder cases to make and to build, that's for sure. And without effective federal enforcement, you're left to local for pressure, arguing that structuring this is to show the history, show the maps that show the different school parks and what the actions have been, and then what the most recent actions have been, and build your case. And I'm telling lots of people on a lot of different contexts, this is the time to build local cases. Mm-hmm. It's not the time to go running to HUD for help.
Right, because
it's the time to build those local cases, develop the history, just develop the pictures, develop the strategy, get the community on board, work locally to try to get the decision made, get them to reject it again. If you've got another statute of limitations issue, that's a longer term activity, but it will put you in a better position when hopefully the administrations change and there will be more receptiveness to this exact kind of environmental issue in a new administration. So now's the time to identify the issue and build the case locally and try to get it accomplished at the local level using all the tools at your arsenal, Title VI, Fair Housing Act, affirmatively furthering fair housing. And then if that's unsuccessful, then you should have timely failures to act on demand to correct the situation, which would be considered to be discriminatory actions under the Fair Housing Act.
Carol?
Yes, I agree with Sarah. Don't forget your state and your local resources, especially with zoning and planning and the like. That's local law. Sometimes the states will preempt localities. For instance, if localities are trying to engage in exclusionary zoning, some states have preempted that and said, hey, you can't zone out multifamily housing or affordable housing. So don't forget those resources. And also don't forget the perhaps federal as well as federal statutes in addition to the Fair Housing Act that might be a source for remedial help. And in the casebook, we have tables and I think robust discussions about laws that complement, stand beside the Fair Housing Act that might also be helpful when challenging practices, whether that be in the financial realm in terms of lending practices that create housing disparities. So just stay connected with fair housing organizations and agencies. Continue to think broadly with regard to what kinds of laws, administrative pathways are available.
Right.
So, given the kind of pressures that our civil rights infrastructure is going on, to how can we where do you see levers of where we can make real progress? How can we strengthen like the current enforcement landscape in this climate of reduced federal involvement, and we're starting to see on the ground a lot of the state agencies also coming under attack. So I like the local approach, but every community doesn't have a fair housing center. But the local people on the ground, the tenants in public housing, the parents who are facing homelessness, there are organizations on the ground working on housing issues. How do we help them move housing forward and fair housing forward? How do we get that education out to them How do we get local attorneys? I mean, I can almost name on my hands and feet the attorneys that do fair housing work. On a, and if we start naming firms, then I got to only use a couple of hands. So, um, how do we? How? I mean, I see your book as maybe a tool that can be used by um, local attorneys to make is it robust enough that a local attorney with a local case can you know set up and carry out a, a effective litigation strategy or negotiating strategy? Because if there's so many, I know there's so many cases out there that need that a lot of local lawyers are afraid to you know get involved.
So this book was actually designed in large part to do exactly that, to provide tips, to give you the background, give tips, think about what your jurisdiction is, think about where you're going to file, think about how you put the case together, even to doing the initial interviews, which a lot of people, frankly, still don't know how to do. Stella, you know more about that than I do, I'm sure. But I found that a lot of people coming new to fair housing don't do the chronology, don't do the overall picture and get the history down. But so I do think the book is designed specifically for investigators and attorneys who would like to know more about this area. The availability of attorney's fees under Fair Housing Act litigation is an incentive for many attorneys. I'm talking to some attorneys these days, newer attorneys who are combining Fair Housing Act claims with negligence claims, for example, in a case, and adding in state law claims and thinking about whether to file in federal or state court. The practitioner's guide part of this talks about all of those things. And at the broader level, when you're talking about building at the community level, I'm old enough to remember in the late 60s and early 70s, actually up until the mid 80s, where the local community was it. HUD did not run a strong fair housing enforcement program. In the 1968 law, they would accept complaints, they could try to settle them, but if it were going to be litigated, the people had to take them to court themselves or occasionally find a pattern and practice case at the department. So I remember when local communities, the religious, the educators, the homeless housers, the HUDs of public housing agency or the residents thereof would all get together in meetings and plan strategy together. And in Louisville, where I spent a lot of my younger years organizing around a whole bunch of issues, including fair housing, but also other issues, we had coalitions of people from different organizations who would turn out, yes, for anti-war activities, but also for fair housing related issues. And so I think we need to rebuild our local community structures. In the South, at least, I would start with our religious leaders and with the organizations that are already in place and well respected in the community for the services they're bringing, because they're more likely to have the connections for change in the community itself. But then it has to be empowered by the voices of the people. It sure does. And the people who can tell you the story of what things were like even 30 or 40 years ago is important. I once gave a presentation at my church, and I was talking about discrimination in the access to health care. And I started talking about redlining and the lack of loans for people of color, and how not only it was redlining, but federal agencies would not make loans in white neighborhoods to people of color, and all the struggles. I had people come up to me, both black and white, and say they'd never heard of such a thing. And so they had never heard of it. They were never taught of it in school. And it was a real insight for me that says sometimes sharing our knowledge helps build a movement. And sharing our connections helps build a movement. And I think we're back to that stage right now, where we're looking to put people together on a particular issue of interest to multiple communities and building a coalition around that It's
Mm-hmm.
no longer one person or three people or five people and a lawyer butting their heads against the wall.
Right.
It's got to be
Right.
almost, we've got to go back to the movement stages. And frankly, we're seeing that movement starting to emerge in different ways in opposition to what's going on with the current administration. And I think picking up on those feelings in Delaware, where I live, there's an opportunity about an organization called Speak Out Against Hate. And that's bringing a lot of people to the table. In other places, it might be indivisible, or it might be two or three pastors getting together and saying, we got to do something about these parks, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
those people then spur their congregations, people they talk to, if they're engaged in it, and they come forward and start building the movement that we now need to do that. It's not any one person. Although I will say that we designed this book to be a tool for lawyers who are advising groups of people like that, and identifying what a good case is and how to build it and how to build it strong and how to think about bringing it forward in your particular circumstances. But I continue to believe that building the movement from the ground up again is what's written in the cards for us right this moment.
Yeah, I totally agree with Sarah. In fact, I recall a conversation we had about who our audience was, and we were just as concerned, maybe even more so, about the small town general practitioner who might be dealing with an eviction case for the rare tenant who had an attorney representing him or her, and who had a vague sense that maybe there was some there in terms of a defense, who didn't know fair housing law, but something smelled fishy, that this could be a tool for that lawyer to use and access to figure out, oh, are there some protected class issues here? Might I have some fair housing issues in addition to, as a defense maybe, to the eviction action? So we were very concerned about making sure that that this book would speak to folks who knew nothing about fair housing law, attorneys, as well as that it would have something to offer for those who were sophisticated and who were ready for the next level of information with regard to documenting cases, gathering information, doing early investigations. Also, I think that every coin has two sides. And so we talked about the digital age and the perils of AI in terms of inserting bias in these decisions and not correcting for bias. But I also think that technology has a role in spreading awareness. So if we use technology to make the community aware that, hey, we're doing a code rewrite, come out and express your concerns about zoning and planning in your community. The city of Richmond is undergoing its zoning plans called Richmond 300, and having community meetings and stakeholder engagement. So I would also say, in addition to those items that Sarah mentioned, that to engage technology as a way of spreading the word, building a platform, connecting with like-minded people is something that we should all be doing as well.
Yeah, and Durham is in the process of going through its code rewrite at this time, and I think it's actually been put on hold because some of the current landowners are saying they didn't get the notice that they were required to get, so they held up the public hearings on that. But one of the things I want to point out is a lot of this is that we don't want to confuse, or there's always been a confusion about affordable housing being fair housing. And that's not necessarily, I say they're often twins, but they're fraternal twins. They're not identical. And and a lot of people, a lot of communities use affordable housing as code language to that they don't want people of color in their neighborhoods, not recognizing that that the majority of people, and I know this is true for Richmond, maybe not Delaware, but
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
for Richmond and Durham, the majority of people who are 80% or below median include school teachers,
Mhm.
firemen, police officers, um, pink collar workers in the government offices, your the person who is filling out your social security form at the social security office. That in Richmond and in Durham, I can stake 100% confidence that all of those folks would qualify for what is CRA and affordable housing under HUD. Um, and in Durham, many of our firefighters and police officers and teachers, nurses, all are at 60% of area median.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so when you don't want that affordable housing, HUD subsidized housing in your community, you don't want your teachers living in your communities. And
Or
so
your
we
or your mothers and your fathers. Where I live, affordable housing is very commonly a need for the parents of people who live in the community because their homes have deteriorated or they can no longer afford them or keep them up. And but they're perfectly capable of living independently. And a one bedroom affordable unit is exactly what they need based on their limited income and all of that. Around here, they talk about workforce housing as code words, a word
Mhm.
about code words coming up. But and I came in, I said, you mean affordable housing, right? And or housing that people can afford to live in. And they said, oh no, we call it workforce housing around here because affordable housing, people are against affordable housing. And so I'm like, really? I object to workforce housing because it leaves out people with disabilities and people who are seniors who are no longer working but who still need affordable rental housing.
And
Parentheses, go ahead.
yeah, and we're
I'll come back
starting
to
to
code
see
words
with the
later.
seniors. I'm worried about the USDA rural housing for
Yeah,
seniors
yes, yes,
because and they have the same duty to affirmatively further.
yes, they do.
And under
And
the
so
Fair Housing Act,
that's
they're
right.
supposed to report on and investigate fair housing claims too. And
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Sarah, but in the 30 plus years that I've been doing fair housing work, I have never seen a fair housing report to Congress from the USDA secretary.
Well, you're right about that. Although I'm familiar with cases that have been brought against USDA funded rural housing under the USDA rural housing program for discrimination on all the bases covered by the Fair Housing Act. So they are covered by the Fair Housing Act and they're covered by Section 504 as well and by Title 6 as well. And so I agree that this has been an overlooked area in terms of oversight, and I have seen the results of that being cases against those communities for illegal discrimination.
But a
Uh,
lot of those are coming off the loans and are going to end up being market rate. Where are all those elderly rural people going to go live?
Well, HUD has the same problem with its Section 8 project-based housing, where the HAP contracts for those housing were for 30 years, and they're expiring or have already expired in some cases. And I have seen a number of cases, including one I worked on right here in Washington, D.C., about the abandonment of the housing by the owners, and then the failure of a city who took the housing over to do what they needed to do in terms of keeping the property up. And so when, as things happen, the conditions get so poor that code enforcement comes in and says there's a violation, then the question is, where are those folks going to live? And I don't know that USDA rural housing is producing very much in the way of new housing. So that's an additional responsibility the community must take on to think about where the housing should be located, new housing that will house the folks who are going to be displaced from some of these properties that are not in good condition and really shouldn't continue to be operated. And that's part of the market for affordable housing. The affordable housing and the fair housing movement are twins. They do come together, and in many communities, those arguments are both fair housing issues when it comes to siting of new housing or the availability of new housing, as well as it is a fair housing community. All the zoning rules impact those communities when you're talking about replacement housing. And I would not want to leave this subject without saying you have to build replacement housing first and then relocate people. The build first context here is increasingly important, to build with the replacement housing before you get rid of the terrible housing, because otherwise people are given vouchers and they're spread all over the earth, and it's hard to find them again, and they get lost in the system, and they can't find decent housing in the community, and they end up doing something that is not conducive to their health and welfare. So this is part of this movement for increased affordable housing, both in rural areas and in urban areas, is critically important for these kinds of housing where the contracts that were entered into 30 years ago are expiring and the properties are not in good shape.
We're in Women's History Month, and we've talked about fair housing in general. We've talked about kind of race and disability, but there's a lot of, and Carol brought up the disproportionality in terms of evictions of women with children, and that, the other protected classes that we haven't really mentioned, and how they have been particularly impacted right now. We see mixed status housing impacting our immigrant communities. We're seeing single mothers. We have, does your book address sexual harassment and in any way some of the difficulties that women, especially those facing foreclosures and facing evictions, are experiencing in disproportionate areas?
Yes. So we talk about gender-based discrimination, not just sexual harassment by the landlord or the landlord's agent. We also think about the dilemma that individuals who are victims of domestic violence experience, and so women would experience that disproportionately, though it would cover men. So if a man is being abused, and if they're denied housing because they've called the police or made a report. So we address those issues, and we also pick up there's a couple of interesting cases in which landlords were being compelled to English only policies. Basically, they were being compelled to refuse to rent to individuals who were not fluent in English or speak English as their first language, which of course has a disparate impact based on a national origin. And so we do cover that material in the book and cover those decisions. And I think increasingly, again, we'll see those areas as maybe burgeoning claims that will be brought perhaps in tandem with race. We'll see the race and gender, or the race and national origin.
Yeah. This area is an area where I, as someone who's worked in this area since the 70s, have really become aware of the increased breadth of the coverage of the Fair Housing Act and how strong it has remained despite numerous attacks in courts and in Congress. And for example, just another example of how sex discrimination occurs. It's come back to lending again. You know, back in the day, women, I remember this, women couldn't get a credit card in their own name. Women couldn't open bank accounts in their own names. I could not get a MasterCard when I first went to apply for credit. And I had a state job. I surely could have afforded and managed a credit card, but I couldn't get one. In today's world, we see lending discrimination based on sex and based on disability relating for women relating to being on maternity leave or the family being on parental leave. And, that was an area where HUD did a number of cases some years ago. And I continue to see those cases in my work, that where a lender says to someone, we won't close on your loan until you come back to work after maternity leave, because there's the bank thinks to work. And I gotta say, I have yet to find a family where both partners aren't working when they have kids, and where the person who bore the child is going back to work. It has to go back to work to have the income that the household needs to pay their bills and keep their heads afloat in this economy.
And take on child care.
And they'll pay for child care. That's right. And so there's these lenders that still say those things, and there are still some like that. One of the areas we cover in the book, but it's also an example of the increased breadth of application of the Fair Housing Act in ways that people might not have thought about 10, 15, 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. I mean, sex was added to the Fair Housing Act in 1974, and I would remember scratching my head thinking, well, what is a sex discrimination case after all? And we've now learned that it includes protection for victims of domestic violence, people who are pregnant, and households that have a pregnant member. It includes protections for all kinds of families, in addition to familial status, where you have a single mom and kids, where it could be gender as well as having a kid. I mean, I remember hearing about and having seen cases where landlords wouldn't rent to someone because they assumed that the woman couldn't cut the grass. I mean, really. I know how to cut the grass. I don't want to, but I do it when I have to, right? And so there are many examples of the way in which the Fair Housing Act has been applied in new ways and in important ways. Criminal history, to attack the use of criminal history as a blanket ban on people's ability to rent housing, is a really important area of evolving law. And it's one where people don't always think about it, and yet if you look at the statistics, you read the new Jim Crow and some other books that have been written about this, you understand that people of color have been more often victimized by the criminal justice system and have criminal histories that have nothing to do with their ability to rent housing today. And so these broad-based criminal history policies are being challenged in multiple ways in multiple jurisdictions today. I don't expect that to change. I think a lot of times you see differences in treatment between a white person with a criminal history and a black person with a criminal history, which the black person never knows about because they don't know how white people are treated, and yet comes back in some cases to plain old unequal treatment. And in some cases, it's a genuine disparate impact case where the policy simply cannot be justified, and where a individualized assessment of that particular applicant would tell the landlord that this is a qualified, capable candidate who should not be excluded because of this criminal history ban that they have in place in their application procedures. This is an important issue. We do talk about it some, I think, in the book, but it's really an emerging issue, like so many others. I mean, for me, the Fair Housing Act was just getting started, just finding its feet, and in its ability to dig down and deal with the deeply embedded biases and discriminatory analyses that often form the basis for decision making. Whether it's a city, that its current leadership would be appalled to know that history, and yet they don't know that history. Or where a lender or an insurance company operates on some broad-based set of assumptions without examining the underlying basis for those assumptions. And the Fair Housing Act was just getting on its feet in its ability to do that. And I think we're at a pause. I don't think we're at a stop. I think we're at a pause. And that tells me that we ought to be regrouping, rebuilding, building our local structures, casting our votes, and rebuilding the fair housing awareness structure. And we hope this book will be helpful to people who are in the process of doing that.
Well, I thank you all for both Carol and Sarah for being with me today on and talking to us about your new book. The new book can be purchased by going to lexisnexis.com/housing. And if you use the promo code housing10, you're entitled to a 10% discount. We've been running the promo for the book in the banner, so just keep watching and doing that. Again, I want to thank Sarah Pratt, my queen, for being on my podcast. I will have you all back on at some other time when we're so we can talk about like some particular cases. Carol, thank you so much. Homegirl, North Carolinian Tar Heel, come from Greensboro. See, the best people have North Carolina connections. I'm just saying.
Wait. I went to college in North Carolina. Do I get to be one of the girls?
I was saying
Absolutely.
I went to St. Andrews, y'all. Come on now.
I would give it out for St. Andrews.
And married a boy from Durham.
I know.
Okay.
Get there, Mike.
Oh yeah.
I count you. I count it all good.
All right.
We got the triangle triad. I see my producer Mark Lee has come in, and just before we close out, Mark, you got any questions for
No, listening, a great and very profound conversation going on. I know a lot of people that are going through housing crisis. As a matter of fact, one of my good friends just recently moved from one house to another because he's not been getting the support that he would like to get, even though he's lived in apartment complexes, including the one that I'm currently living in and everything like that, but definitely is not be getting the support, surprisingly, even from some of the churches. So he was getting frustrated when the churches that he was going to were giving him the runaround and all along those lines. So definitely that's something that I've seen happen to a number of folks. So if you have any ideas of where folks can go if they are in the housing needs, particularly here in Durham, I would love to hear that, because I know that's been a concern of his for the last, I want to say 2 or 3 years, because he's been in different housing situations for a number of years and all along those lines. But I do know that he just recently talked to him yesterday in the process of moving from one apartment to the other, and is still not in a environment that he feels overly comfortable with, and all along those lines. So the fact that y'all have, I would greatly appreciate, but I was listening to the show. And Sarah, I have a good friend of mine that graduated from St. Andrews, so I know that that's in Laurinburg and everything like that, because they graduated. Miss Anne Franklin did that back in the 80s and everything like that. So she's a Laurin graduate as well.
Great. Fabulous. Stella, I would say take a look at the 811, 202, 811 housing programs in Durham that provide supportive services on site. Stella will know more about what's in Durham, but there's particular HUD-funded housing that might help your friend.
I'll get with you, Mark, and do that. Carol, any closing remarks before we go?
Okay. Well, it's just been a pleasure to be on with you and to think about these issues. I think the landscape is complicated, but there are a lot of opportunities. Maybe on our next podcast, we will have more coming back with regard to ways that we can maybe increase the stock of affordable housing by bringing existing structures that are maybe being put to commercial uses online for residential use, because I do think that the quickest way to create affordable housing is to use existing structures. And I'm also interested to see whether Mayor Mondami and President Trump's initiatives to try to push back on corporate ownership of housing, whether there's some there with regard to the affordability issue. So perhaps we'll have a little bit more information on that, and that would be interesting to talk about on a future.
That sounds exciting, because the corporate landlord issue and is one that is of particular interest in North Carolina, and also
and other states. Yep.
And also the idea of
adaptive reuse.
adaptive reuse of buildings. I think that's something that we've been pretty successful with in Durham,
Yes.
in changing the hosiery mill into senior housing and changing and converting a school into senior housing. So we've had some success
Yeah,
with doing
Stella,
that
before you
in
close out, I
Durham.
wanted to mention that we've been doing the film festival, and one of the films we'll be showing this afternoon will deal with a little bit of housing because that's been definitely the organizing that has been going on that Leo Wise was part of. So that film will be shown this afternoon at 7 o'clock, and Leo will be there and everything like that. So there are several films that have dealt with uh, gentrification and other things. Matter of fact, Last Man in San Francisco was one of those films that we showed yesterday that dealt with gentrification, and then there was some around black masculinity with Moonlight. But there are definitely several films that'll be shown, including that one that'll deal with organizing that'll be going on this evening as part of day 3 of the film festival at the Hayti Heritage Center.
Excellent.
So for my folks in Durham in the Triangle, the Hayti Heritage Film Festival is going on this weekend. It's always a great time and a great opportunity to interact with Black filmmakers and Black films. Thank you all.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you, Stella.
Thank you so much. You brought us joy.
Love you, Sarah. Well, folks, this has been a great episode of Doing Justice Brings Joy. But I do want to say just take a minute to talk about all the things as a closing reflection. I want to bring us back to the world we are living in right now. The world our fair housing work does not escape. The world our communities are carrying on their shoulders. In just the past 7 days, we've watched North Carolina move through another round of elections, local choices that are going to shape our schools, our courts, our neighborhoods, and everyday lives of the people we serve. These decisions matter, and I want to thank everyone who voted in the primary. Your vote helps shape who gets heard, who gets protected, and who gets left behind. And beyond our state lines, we're watching heartbreaking violence unfold across the globe, including the ongoing war in Iran. We've witnessed families displaced, children's lives, 200 little girls' lives lost. We see a region on the edge. And even here at home, people are carrying fear for their loved ones abroad. There is confusion and exhaustion as they try to make sense of what this means related to global stability and for their own loved ones. All of this is happening as we enter a sacred season. Lent has begun. Ramadan has begun. These are two traditions, Christian and Muslim, periods that are calling millions of people into fasting, reflection, repentance, and renewal at the very same time. It is a reminder that we are, in so many ways, people of the book, children of Abraham, bound by stories of struggle, liberation, sacrifice, and hope. So in this moment, this heavy, complicated moment, I want to invite us into a posture of prayer, reflection, and responsibility. Not a passive prayer, but the kind that strengthens our hands for the work ahead. The kind of prayer that reminds us that justice is not an abstract idea. It is a daily practice. The kind of prayer that calls us to see one another's humanity, even across lines of faith, race, nation, and politics. Because whether we are talking about fair housing, elections, or global conflict, the truth is the same. We belong to one another. And our work, your work, my work, the work of giants like Sarah Pratt and Carol Brown, is to keep building a world where that belonging is real, where it is protected, and where it is lived in the policy, in practice, and in community. May this season of Lent, Ramadan, Women's History Month be a reminder that justice is sacred, that courage is contagious, and that hope is a discipline we practice together. Thank you for joining me this week on Doing Justice Brings Joy.